Chapter 27, Fluid, Electrolyte, and Acid-Base Balance. In this PowerPoint, I want to hit some important points that are definitely on the test. There's a lot of information here that I'm going to skip over. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It's just that I want to go through things that are definitely on the test. Skip ahead here. Intracellular fluid. Now this is the fluid that is inside of the cells that makes up the cytosol within the cells. And you can see here in this graphic that we have the cations and the anions. The cations are the positively charged ions, and the anions are the negatively charged ions. And then also notice that you have proteins here, which are not ions, but they do carry that negative charge. So they're included here with the negative ions. Notice that inside of the cell we have a large portion of it being the positively charged potassium. We also have a lot of proteins within the cytosol, and then we also have this phosphate here. This graphic shows the plasma, and notice that we have the same basic cations and anions, but they're in different concentrations. So when you notice here that we have sodium that is in a large concentration and chloride ions in a large concentration, and if we go back here and we compare it, sodium was in a very small concentration in the intracellular fluid and potassium was in the larger concentration. And then over here we had chloride in a smaller concentration inside of the cell and phosphate in the larger concentration, and much more proteins as well. So again, you see that comparison and where you find these different ions. Okay, then we have the interstitial fluid. So the interstitial fluid is the fluid that surrounds the cells. This is the tissue fluid. Again, notice here that we have sodium ions and potassium ions, which are both positive, sodium in the greater concentration here, and we have the chloride ions as well in a greater concentration. And then notice here the bicarbonate ions, a larger, relatively larger concentration in the interstitial fluid compared to the intracellular fluid. Okay, so make sure that you look at those three comparisons there. All right, ion exchange. So notice here that we have an exchange between the different fluids, and this occurs through osmosis, diffusion, and carrier-mediated transport. And hopefully you remember those different processes from Bio 168. Okay, next I want to talk about different hormones that regulate fluid and electrolyte balance. We finished the endocrine system and the urinary system already, and I'm sure you remember these hormones from those different systems. So you may need to go back and do a little review there, but we're going to talk about how these hormones regulate fluid and electrolyte balance. So first of all, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. As we know, an antidiuretic causes you to retain more water. So a diuretic causes you to lose water, and an antidiuretic causes you to retain more water. And this can be due to a lower blood pressure. So if the blood pressure gets too low, you need more water in your plasma, and so you can retain more water by reducing urinary loss. And this concentrates the urine so that the water stays within the body, and you get rid of more of the electrolytes. The thirst center is also stimulated to make you take in more fluids. Okay, next we have aldosterone. And as you remember, aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal cortex, and it activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So what this does is it causes the kidneys to conserve sodium ions, and that stimulates water retention. So remember that water follows salt. So when you have a greater concentration of salt, the water is going to stay with the salt and follow the salt to help to even it out. Natriuretic peptides, so remember ANP and BNP are these peptides made up of amino acids that are also considered hormones, and they're released by the cardiac muscle cells, so the muscle cells of the heart, in response to the stretching of the heart walls. So this would be due to an increased blood pressure. And one way for the body to decrease the blood pressure is to get rid of excess water in the plasma. So by reducing the thirst, drink less, and that reduces the blood pressure. It also blocks the release of antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. So it works in opposition to the ADH and aldosterone. It also causes diuresis, which is, remember, losing water through the urine. So that lowers the blood pressure by lowering the plasma volume. Okay, this is a good table to look at here. You don't really need to know all of these volumes here as far as daily input and daily output, but it is a good overview to kind of see where are you getting fluid from and how are you losing fluid throughout the day. So we have the gaining of fluid through food and liquid that's consumed, and then also metabolic water, which comes from hopefully you remember cellular respiration that occurs in the mitochondria. And one of the products of cellular respiration is water. So a small amount of water does come from that metabolic process. And then we have the losses. So of course, urination, evaporation from the skin, which would be in the form of sweating, evaporation from the lungs, just as you are breathing and talking, the air that you are breathing out is moisturized, and so you are losing water through your exhaling, and then also loss in feces. So notice here that you have a balance when you have the input equaling the output. Now, you would end up with an imbalance if you were taking in less water than you were losing, and then eventually that could lead to dehydration. And you could also have an imbalance if you were bringing in a whole lot more water than what you were losing during the day. And so then you would be retaining fluids. So here I want to talk about the distribution of water gains. So it's water is gained, but electrolytes are, if water is gained but electrolytes are not, then the water is going to change the volume of the extracellular fluids, and the fluids would become hypotonic. So again, hopefully you remember from Bio 168 about the tonicity, and you have hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic. You may need to go back and review those concepts if you don't remember. So the extracellular fluid would be hypotonic compared to the intracellular fluid. So the fluid would shift there and the water would move into the cells. So that may result in hyperhydration, an excess of water, and that causes the cells to swell up. So remember, when a cell is placed into a hypotonic solution, then it causes the cell to swell, and if it is so hypotonic that it causes such an imbalance, it could actually cause a cell to burst. So things that can cause hyperhydration, one thing is drinking too much water. This would be very excessive drinking of water. An injection of a hypotonic solution into the bloodstream, such as IV fluids. The inability to eliminate through urine. So problems with renal failure, heart failure, cirrhosis, and endocrine disorders, excessive antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so this diagram shows homeostasis, and homeostasis specifically of the sodium ions in the extracellular fluid. So remember that with homeostasis, we're always maintaining this balance. So if there is a stimulus it's that detection of a change. So for instance, the sodium level increases, so that's going to be detected by the receptors. The osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus would be stimulated, and they would stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone, which is going to go to the kidneys and cause the kidneys to reabsorb more water. It also promotes the thirst centers so that you are promoted to drink more water. So bringing in more water, maintaining more water, that is going to cause the sodium ion levels to start to balance out. And so it would decrease that concentration by bringing in more water. So again, remember that water follows sodium. And so that's going to decrease the sodium ion level of the extracellular fluid. In this diagram, we see the opposite of that. So we see the decreasing sodium ion levels in the extracellular fluid, and then that stimulus is picked up again by those osmoreceptors of the hypothalamus, and we see the opposite happening here. The antidiuretic hormone secretion decreases, the kidneys are going to begin to lose more water through the urine, thirst is suppressed, and then that is going to help to balance out the sodium ion levels. So it's going to increase the sodium level as you get rid of more water. Here's some terms that you need to know. Disorders of sodium balance. So hyponatremia. The body water content rises through hyperhydration, and that means that the sodium ion concentration is going to be lower of the extracellular fluid. You don't have to know this number here, but you can see here less than 135 milliequivalents per liter. And then you also have hypernatremia. So that would be the opposite there, where the sodium ion concentration is greater than 145 milliequivalents per liter. So this is from dehydration, not enough water mixed in with the sodium. And then hyponatremia is too much water mixed in with the sodium. Okay, here we have the homeostasis of the normal extracellular fluid volume. So maintaining that volume of water. So our stimulus here, increasing volume of the extracellular fluid and or fluid and sodium gain. And so the cardiac muscle cells are going to detect that because there's going to be more pressure there on those muscle cells. And that's going to cause the release of the ANP, and that's going to affect the hypothalamus, the kidneys, and the blood vessels. So the hypothalamus is going to reduce the thirst. The kidneys are going to help to get rid of more water in the urine and increase sodium loss in the urine. And the blood vessels are going to vasodilate. There's also going to be an inhibition of the antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, epinephrine, and norepinephrine release. So all of this is helping to get rid of more fluids and get rid of sodium so that it brings the blood pressure down. And so that decreases the volume and brings the blood pressure down in the plasma. Here we have homeostasis in the opposite direction, where we have decreasing volume of the extracellular fluid. And so how is the body going to bring that decrease back to normal? So again, the stimulus is the decreasing. The baroreceptors are going to, so those are detect the pressure, so that blood pressure. It's going to activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is going to stimulate the heart and the blood vessels to increase the cardiac output and peripheral vasoconstriction. So by increasing the cardiac output, running more blood through the heart per minute, increasing the cardiac output. Also an increase of antidiuretic hormone. So retaining more water, increased thirst, retaining more sodium as well. And so the endocrine response of the kidneys, we have the renin-angiotensin system there. So renin release leads to angiotensin 2 activation. Remember that cascade that we talked about in the endocrine system. And that is going to promote aldosterone release. And so all of this is going to increase the volume of the extracellular fluid. So now I want to talk about disorders of potassium imbalance. So before we were talking about sodium imbalance and water imbalance, and now potassium imbalance, and how does that affect the fluids. So hypokalemia, so remember hypo means below, that's a deficiency of potassium ions in the blood, in the plasma. And then we have the opposite of that, hyperkalemia, which would be an elevated level of potassium within the blood. This diagram shows how when the blood concentration of potassium falls, and here we have a number for you. You do not have to memorize this at this point, but 2 milliequivalents per liter. The extensive muscular weakness develops, eventual paralysis, and you may remember, hopefully you remember from the muscular system, how sodium and potassium are involved in that muscle contraction. And so this is why it's such an important factor in weakness and paralysis, is because it's such an important ion in the muscle contraction. Also, it's potentially lethal due to the effects on the heart. So again, the heart, that cardiac muscle, the ions are moving across the membrane there as well. So it's extremely important ion. Then we have the high concentration. So high concentration can also be dangerous. And remember, that's hyperkalemia. And it occurs when the potassium ion concentration exceeds 7 milliequivalents per liter. And that can result in a cardiac arrhythmia. So our normal range here is 3.5 to 5. That's going to be the normal range of potassium in the blood. So what are some factors that promote hypokalemia? So the potassium ions being low. Some diuretics can cause the potassium levels to decrease by increasing the volume of urine produced. So you do lose some potassium through the urine, and if it's an extreme diuretic that gets rid of potassium, then you could end up losing too much. An endocrine disorder called aldosteronism, excessive aldosterone secretion, that can also result in hypokalemia. And then also overstimulating sodium retention can cause potassium loss. So remember, those two ions, they work together in pumping across the membrane. So remember, when you have sodium going in one direction, you have potassium going in the other direction. And so those two are going to be coordinated there as to when one is retained, the other is generally going to be lost. Okay, the factors promoting hyperkalemia, we have chronically low blood pressure, chronically low blood pH promotes hyperkalemia, and it interferes with the potassium excretion by the kidneys. We also have kidney failure due to damage or disease. It's going to prevent normal release of potassium in the urine. And then there's different drugs that promote diuresis by blocking sodium reabsorption by the kidneys. And remember, again, that's coordinated there. When sodium is reabsorbed, when it's slowed down, so the potassium secretion is going to slow down as well. Okay, I also want to mention here with calcium homeostasis. So the parathyroid hormone, PTH, and calcitriol, they both raise calcium ion concentrations. And then we have calcitonin, which does the opposite of that. It opposes the parathyroid hormone and the calcitriol. Okay, acid-base balance. So the pH. It's extremely important that the pH of the body, especially the plasma, be maintained. So the pH of extracellular fluid, and by this, one of the main things that we're talking about here is the blood plasma. You do need to know this number here. It needs to be kept within 7.35 to 7.45. That's a very important number there. That's a very narrow range for pH. And also notice that that is slightly basic. So 7 remember, is neutral, and below 7 is going to be acidic, above 7 is going to be basic. So it has to be maintained there within that range. This is a good table here to look at some terminology and to review these terms about the pH. So make sure that you go through this. And one important thing that we're going to mention here is the buffer systems. So a substance that tends to oppose changes in the pH of a solution by removing or replacing hydrogen ions in body fluids, buffers maintain blood pH within normal limits, 7.35 to 7.45. So buffers are going to maintain that range. Some terms that you need to know: acidosis. So acidosis is caused by an abnormally low blood pH. So acidemia is when the blood pH is lower than 7.35, and this can be dangerous. Alkalosis is the opposite of that, so an abnormally high blood pH, and that alkalemia is when the blood pH is above 7.45. Here I want to talk about the bicarbonate ions. So the carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And this is important because this is how carbon dioxide, CO2, is carried through the blood. It is carried attached there with the as carbonic acid. So think about acid, more acidic, more hydrogen ions. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide, so that's represented with the PCO2. That's the most important factor in affecting the blood pH. It's also, as we're going to see in the respiratory factor, the most important factor in stimulating breathing. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and pH are inversely related. When carbon dioxide levels rise, hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions are released and the pH decreases. At the alveoli, the carbon dioxide diffuses into the atmosphere, and hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions in alveolar capillaries decrease and the blood pH rises. So keep in mind that the pH decreasing is becoming more acidic. Okay, the pH rising means that it's becoming more basic. The lower you go, below 7, that's acidic. Above 7 is basic. So keep that in mind. And so hydrogen ions being released, making it more acidic. Hydrogen ions being taken up makes it more basic. So here we have the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, and we can see here carbon dioxide. Of course, we are getting rid of carbon dioxide in the lungs, so that's what we're trying to breathe out here. And the carbon dioxide and water are going to come together to form this carbonic acid. And then the carbonic acid is going to dissociate into the hydrogen ion and the bicarbonate ion. Okay, so notice here CO2 plus H2O. That gives us H2CO3, which is our carbonic acid. And then that dissociates, it breaks apart. So we have the hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate ions. So that's a buffer system. Then we have the bicarbonate reserve here. So we have sodium ions that are going to interact with the bicarbonate ions, and that gives us sodium bicarbonate. So it provides a reserve when the bicarbonate ions are needed, that it can be released from the sodium bicarbonate to be used here in the buffer system. Okay, so notice that this bicarbonate, it's going to be, we're going in this direction now. So the bicarbonate ion is released here. So that reserve is released, and that's going to take up the hydrogen ions, which are going to bring the pH up, make it less acidic by taking up hydrogen ions. Okay, so here we have, we'll start here with the sodium bicarbonate, releasing the bicarbonate ions, bicarbonate ion plus the hydrogen ion. So hydrogen ions coming from acids, fixed acids or metabolic acids, add hydrogen ions. When the two come together, this carbonic acid is going to increase, and then when it goes to the lungs, the carbonic acid is going to release the carbon dioxide to the lungs so that it can be breathed out. The last thing I want to talk about is respiratory acidosis. So this develops when the respiratory system cannot get rid of the carbon dioxide that's being generated by the body. And this low blood pH due to hypercapnia, which is high blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hypercapnia. So that is low blood pH below that 7.35 that is is because of specifically the respiratory system, so that carbon dioxide there. A primary cause of this is hypoventilation, a low respiratory rate, not getting rid of enough carbon dioxide. Then we have some different things, acute versus chronic here. So acute develops with the decline in pH is severe. It's immediate, life-threatening. Chronic respiratory acidosis develops as the respiratory function is compromised due to some larger failure with the lungs, such as with emphysema. Okay, and then respiratory alkalosis is high blood pH due to hypocapnia, which is low carbon dioxide level, and the primary cause is hyperventilation, an abnormally high respiratory rate, breathing rate too much because of stress or some perceived danger. So that can cause that hyperventilation. Okay, so that's the end of our PowerPoint for this chapter. These are things that are important that are going to be on the test. So make sure that you study these specific slides and this information from your textbook.